Good day, everybody. Welcome to one and all here to the International Law Institute in Washington, D.C. My name is Gerard Botha. I am the Director of Programs here at the International Law Institute. Today, we are having a discussion as part of our COVID-19 series. And the title is The Infrastructure Gap, COVID-19 and the Need for Project Preparation. Some of the other topics in this series, we invite you to visit our website at www.ili.org to see some of these topics in a little more depth. They relate to managing teams in a crisis, emergency procurement, medical supply procurement, food security in the light of present circumstances, and more. So you are very welcome to find out more about these programs and also our other programs on our website. But today it is our privilege to welcome Dr. Cesar Quiros, who is a course advisor here at the ILI and also a teacher, of course. And he's formerly from the World Bank, where he spent many years in different capacities, including as a lead highways advisor and principal highway engineer. And before he joined the World Bank, he was the deputy director of the Brazilian Road Research Institute in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And in addition to being a professional civil engineer, he is also a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome, as always, Cesar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Cesar Queiroz, and I'll give you a brief presentation on infrastructure gap, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the need for more project preparation. Let me start with the infrastructure gap. The Global Infrastructure Hub, GIH, carried out a study of 56 countries, evaluating their existing infrastructure, their needs for better and more infrastructure, and the difference between what they're investing now and what they should invest to get better infrastructure in their countries. They did this for 56 countries, as I said, and came up with trillions of dollars that would be needed for the countries to reach an acceptable level by 2014. Let me give an example for 4 of the countries that were included in the study, specifically Brazil, China, India, and the US. In Brazil, the current investment is around $1.5 trillion for the period up to year 2040. And the needs were estimated at $2.7 trillion. And the difference, 1.2, is the investment gap, which is then $1.2 trillion. And for China, $2 trillion, for India, 0.6, and for the US, $3.8 trillion. So for these 4 countries, a sample of the 56 countries studied, it amounts to more than $7 trillion infrastructure gap. Once the acute phase of COVID-19 epidemic is over, the government will need more infrastructure to accelerate economic recovery, create jobs, a lot of them being lost now with the crisis, reduce poverty, and stimulate productive investments. The 2 challenges governments are facing, or will face, once the crisis is over. The infrastructure multi-trillion-dollar financing gap, and the second one, there will be fewer public resources to invest. So could it be public financing alone? We don't believe so. Government budgets alone will not be enough to finance the infrastructure investments and services needed. As stated by The Economist in a recent issue, the pandemic will leave the world deep in debt. Then private participation becomes essential, and the consequent need to prepare bankable projects, that is, projects that can attract private financing. Let me summarize here for the last 10 years how much investment there has been in private investments in infrastructure in the last 10 years. This is published in the latest edition 2020 by the World Bank Private Participation in Infrastructure, PPI. This shows that there was a peak in 2012 with almost $180 billion invested in developing countries. In 2016, this went a little bit lower than $80 billion. And now in the last 3 years, 2017, 2018, and 2019, the investments in private infrastructure has been around $100 billion a year. So what's going to happen in 2020? Certainly with the pandemic, it should be lower than $100 billion, we believe, but it should pick up later because governments will need to involve more private financing so that they can not only bridge the gap, infrastructure gap, but also recover from the current pandemic. Let me summarize here how private infrastructure in private financing infrastructure can work. The PPP arrangements, public-private partnership, can take different formats or different forms depending on the source of revenue to the private sector. So what I did here, I used 3 colors to illustrate how the flow of money, how the cash flow to the private investor can be originated. In blue, it's from the users, so no government payment. It's totally blue, and we have a totally blue on the extreme left. So the first block, the first rectangle in the graph on the left side, all the revenues to the private sector would come from the users. For example, if it's a road, could be from tolling. If it's a power plant, tariff is paid on the kilowatt hour generated by the power plant. So those are the user fees. On the extreme right, I have availability payments. So those are annual payments made by the government to the private investors, the concessionaires, during the operation and maintenance period of the project. So on the extreme right, there is no payment whatsoever during the construction period. All the payments are made by the government during the operation of the project. And in between, we have all the possible combinations. The second block from the left, I have user fees. Still most of the revenue coming from the user fees, but help from the government in terms of the availability payments. So this is a combination of part of the revenues coming from the public sector and part coming from the users of the facility. Then in the third, we have construction subsidy. So construction subsidy is a contribution by the government to the private sector during the construction phase of the project. And then once the project is built, the private sector will start charging user fees. And we could also have a combination of both availability payment and construction subsidy in the same project, in addition to user fees. And the next to the left, on the right, we don't have any user fees, and all the revenues to the private sector will come from the government. First, during the construction subsidy, and then availability payments. Here at the ILI, the International Law Institute, we have the capability to simulate and to carry out financial assessment of all these combinations of PPP projects. Let me summarize by concluding that, first of all, this was just a brief introduction to the impact of the pandemic on infrastructure and the need for more infrastructure. So even though COVID-19 presents many additional challenges, the existing infrastructure gap still needs to be bridged. Will indeed become more pressing and urgent. We present 2 courses to address these issues here at the International Law Institute. The first is the project preparation to bridge the infrastructure gap, to be presented online during August 24, 28, 2020. And the second, also to be presented in 2020, is the PPP financial and risk analysis, which will be held at the International Law Institute here in Washington during November 16 to 20, 2020, later this year. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cesar, very much indeed. So everybody, like Cesar said, this is just a short introduction. You know how important this topic is. And in November the 16th to the 20th, we hope that it will be in person here at the ILI in Washington, D.C. You are welcome. We look forward to speaking with you in the meantime, to welcoming you here, and thank you for your attention. Goodbye.